macabre, gruesome and horrifying, ghastly, of pertaining to, dealing with, or representing death, especially its grimmer or uglier aspect, of or suggestive of the allegorical dance of death. Prepare yourself for these macabre moments. This is Marie Samuels, and thank you all for tuning in. I am so super excited to speak with tonight's guest. This being my Christmas special, I wanted to have someone on who's proficient, radical, and with new theories. This man has authored dozens of books, been on numerous TV shows, and has written probably hundreds of articles for many different reputable publications. I am humbled to welcome the legendary Nick Redfern to the show. Thank you for being here, Nick.
Oh, hey, Marie. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my honor, pleasure. I'm just thrilled. This is fantastic. So you've written on so many topics that I wasn't really sure where to start with you tonight. But then I read your recent article that you posted on mysteriousuniverse.org titled The Hazards of Psychic Backlash. Mm-hmm. And that's when I knew exactly what we would be talking about.
Okay.
Now this is a theory that isn't heard about enough in my opinion, so hopefully we can explore this rare and frightening idea that most of my listeners probably haven't heard yet, as my holiday gift for my parapeeps. So first let me say that this theory has plagued me since I read Round Trip to Hell in a Flying Saucer about 3 years ago. And you were a contributor to that book.
That's correct, yeah, the one that Tim Beckley put out.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic book. I recommend it for anybody. It's a collaboration of many different authors in the field. Brad Steiger's in there. Timothy Green Beckley put it together, and he did a lot of the majority of the writing. But the information in that sucker is just mind-blowing and absolutely frightening. So then I read your article, your recent post, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the story of the project between the Department of Defense and Ray Boucher in order to contact non-human entities, or NHEs, and who Ray Boucher was.
Yeah, sure. This is a story that I came across about 3 or 4 years ago, the first time I spoke to Ray. And Ray lives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he's both an Anglican priest and also a former state director for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. And it was back in the 1980s when Ray ran the Nebraska office of MUFON. And, you know, like a lot of us in the UFO field, occasionally you get contacted by people who want to relate information. But Ray's, I guess, most significant experience in relation to all this occurred in 1991 when he was approached by two physicists working on a Department of Defense project to contact, or to try and contact, the intelligences or the entities behind the UFO phenomenon. And this was sort of like a secret UFO program that really nobody knew about. But the reason why the two guys approached Ray was because they wanted to get his opinion on something they'd uncovered, because he'd had background in religion, but also a background in the UFO phenomenon. And it turned out that the initial goal of this operation, this program, was to, as I said, to try and contact the intelligences behind the UFO phenomenon. And at this point, this would have been probably in the 80s, the scenario was, well, they're extraterrestrial, you know, we're dealing with extraterrestrials.
Right.
But as time went on, the project people who essentially tried to contact these entities through like mind power, like psychic phenomena and ESP, it wasn't like in person, but they would have these sort of experiences where they would kind of link their minds up with these entities. But over time, a lot of the people on the project died, and there was ill health, and weird runs of bad luck would just sort of, you know, just dominate the whole program. And this went on and on to the point where eventually the people on the project came to believe that they actually weren't dealing with extraterrestrials, but they were dealing with something that was literally demonic, that sort of masquerading as extraterrestrial. In other words, it was like a case of camouflage, using the UFO subject as a camouflage to allow these demonic or supernatural entities to get their claws into us, so to speak, and kind of reel us in. And so that's why they wanted to speak with Ray, because they pointed out to him that there was this backlash going on, and Ray, as an Anglican priest and a UFO researcher, had come across cases before where people had been sort of either physically or psychologically damaged by going into the UFO subject, and it kind of dovetailed with all the information that he'd uncovered over the years. And I wrote about this in a book called Final Events a few years ago, which tells the story of Ray's experience and expands upon what this group learned. And it does demonstrate that, if you start digging into some of these more paranormal-themed realms, then, I don't say it's all bad, because it certainly isn't, but it's like with the human race, there are good people and bad people. And it's kind of like in the supernatural realm, you get negative entities, and sometimes, like a character who has a weak personality or isn't really sure what they're doing, they can end up in a lot of trouble and damage and negativity if these things kind of get their claws into you.
Well, especially if the theory is true that, I mean, not that, aliens are benign, but if the theory is true that they're actually demons, then yeah, there's an extreme amount of danger involved there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it sort of comes down to how you define, what a demon is. I mean, you can look throughout history and all sorts of different religions. Sort of Christianity talks about literal demons. Then, you have the jinn, the Middle Eastern jinn, which is,
right.
Which is kind of pretty much like a demon. It's like a hostile supernatural entity that hates the human race. That defines demons as well. So I think what this kind of all tells us is that there are sort of other realms of existence. One person might call it heaven or hell, and somebody else calls it a multi-dimension or whatever, or something like that. We don't really know, but I think there's no doubt in my mind that there are sort of other realms of existence, and there are creatures or entities that dwell in these realms that sort of have a hatred of us, and they like to manipulate us and use us and torment us, and just occasionally kill us, possibly even. There are a lot of disturbing stories about people have been dabbling particularly in like occult things and paranormal issues, where they've suddenly developed very, very serious illnesses, and in some cases died, and they've actually kind of felt that it could all be traced back to when they first started getting into this sort of darker side of things.
So now the Collins elite, is that what they called this group of men, that the Department of Defense physicist and Ray Roche?
Well, it's kind of confusing, and I point this out in the book that, by my own admission, I think I only got part of the story because it's buried so deeply. But the group that I was able to speak to was called the Collins Elite. They were like a sort of a semi-official think tank. But it sounds, in retrospect to me, that the group that Ray spoke with in person, that it may have been a very similar organisation or a similar small group, but the two were working sort of in tandem with each other and looking at different things from different aspects. It sounds like the group that Ray was talking about were just purely trying to contact these things. The Collins Elite were trying to figure out if they could actually somehow use the technology or the powers that these creatures possess from like a military perspective, which is kind of like a crackpot, crazy thing to do, but it's the sort of thing you could imagine actually being done.
Exactly.
And the Collins Elite seems to go back a long time, whereas Ray got the impression that the project, the guys he was talking to were working on, probably kicked off in the 80s. So there probably was some sort of a connection, but I also think there could be sort of differences between the two groups as well.
So they weren't one and the same?
Well, I don't think they were, but in saying that, there could have been like a larger umbrella group, and then the Collins Elite and Ray's group were sort of subdivisions of it. I think that's a possibility as well. But it's one of these things where, Ray met 2 members of the group, I met 3 or 4, and, if there were over the 30 or 40 years, there could have been hundreds of people in the group altogether, but the problem is that most of them haven't come forward, which is natural, really. When you're dealing with something like this, that most people probably wouldn't want to speak out about the sort of things they did. But every now and again, I still get sort of snippets of data that suggests the group is still going, or that adds a little bit to the story, say from the 50s or the 60s or whatever.
So I'm actually looking at your section of the round trip to hell in a flying saucer, and they're referencing Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons, and this would be the Collins elite that were working with Aleister Crowley.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why...
this is how far back it goes, yeah.
Yeah, this is why I think it's probably a different program to the one Ray was talking about. Now, Ray did tell me that the project members that he was speaking to, they did make a connection between all the UFO phenomenon and Crowley and Parsons, but it seems to be that they maybe inherited this information from the early files put together by the Collins elite, because their files go back reportedly to the late 40s and early 50s when, for example, Parsons, who was one of America's sort of greatest rocket engineers and developers of rocketry in the 30s and 40s, he was actually a deep devotee of Crowley's work and actually ran Crowley's office out in Pasadena, California. And but he was also someone with a top secret clearance with the Army, Navy, and Air Force because he was a brilliant rocket scientist. And so, in other words, there were people in government and the military who knew very well about the links between Crowley and Parsons, but they kind of turned a blind eye to it because, you know, Parsons was a really good rocket scientist. But over the years, the years that followed, it went not from just being interested in Parsons' rocket-based research, but it then developed into taking an interest in the occult angle of what he was doing to see if it could be sort of militarized. The idea of, you know, well, if these entities that Parsons and Crowley are contacting, if they have these extraordinary powers, is there a way we can harness them so, you know, you wouldn't just be fighting wars with guns, rockets, or missiles or whatever. You could use supernatural powers to defeat the enemy. That was kind of the goal they were looking at.
So, and then they apparently, they also reference, or at least you reference, the Ouija board that a contactee, George Hunt Williamson made some of his contacts via the Ouija board, but the Collins elite discredited it because they didn't believe that the Ouija board was a tool that demons can exploit. Which is actually, you know, I mean, commonly most people think that's the gateway to hell is the Ouija board, so that's kind of a strange...
Well, yeah, I mean, the important thing to note is, you know, the members of the Collins elite and all the different people that looked into these topics, you know, they're kind of just like us. They're everyday people. But so, in other words, you had one person who had one opinion and somebody else who had another opinion. But yeah, George Hunt Williamson was one of the most famous so-called contactees of the 1950s. Now, you know, most of the contactees talked about having face-to-face encounters with alien entities in the deserts in California and New Mexico and places like that. But George Hunt Williamson's experiences, many of them did occur via Ouija boards, and he said that pretty much all of the sort of contacts and messages through these alleged alien entities did come via Ouija boards. Now, some researchers, you know, take the view that if you use a Ouija board, you know, the person you want to contact is the one that comes through. But many people do also take the view that if you sort of concentrate deeply on trying to call something through, sometimes you may get one of these negative deceptive entities that masquerades as, you know, a dead relative or something like that. And you think you're speaking to the person you want to speak to, but it's actually something very, very different and far more sinister. And so for that reason, there are a lot of questions raised as to exactly what was it that Williamson was talking to. Was it really aliens, or was it some sort of demonic thing that was basically telling Williamson exactly what he wanted to hear, you know?
Right. Well, and it's really intriguing, the connection with Aleister Crowley and the Collins elite, and then the Collins elite with this project with the DoD and Ray Brochet, just because Aleister Crowley seems, you know, very well known as like the king of evil, you know what I mean, or
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of demonstrates sort of the historical timeline of how they got into all this, because Crowley, back in actually 1918, had engaged in this sort of ancient ritual to conjure up like supernatural entities, and he actually succeeded in conjuring up a creature that became known as Lamb, Lam, which basically looks, for all intents and purposes, like one of the so-called greys from modern-day ufology, and that became part of their sort of scenario and theory as to why this was all interconnected as well.
So this could be a theory based on their experience or stories that they've heard of Aleister Crowley and what he conjured and dealt with.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. I mean, I'm sure there are other people within the DoD and outside of it, obviously, that totally disagree with the Collins elite's theories. And it comes down to, again, how different people interpret the data. There are people who've sort of taken the view that Crowley, when he conjured up this entity called Lamb, and as I said, if you Google Lamb, Lam, you see the pictures. The picture that Crowley himself drew, it does look very much like a so-called alien grey. Now, some people take the view that the extraterrestrial phenomenon is real, but it's not so much nuts and bolts, that we can actually contact these entities via our minds and also in altered states, which is how Crowley and Parsons achieved many of their contacts, was literally using sort of psychedelics and drugs and things like that. But other people take the view that, well, no, they're not extraterrestrial, they're demonic. Other people think it's interdimensional, so I think that there are a lot of different theories, and we really don't know the answers. But what we do know for sure is that, or what I think, we know for sure, is that when we sort of open doors and we allow these things through, sometimes, we don't always get a pleasant experience, that there are, hazards and hazardous things out there to deal with. And I think that's why the Collins elite concluded that it was sort of literally demonic, and others may have just concluded it's sort of like a negative extraterrestrial entity. We were sort of very much still in the dark, I think, even today.
Well, and it wasn't just the Collins elite, but it was the two physicists and Ray Boucher had also concluded that the UFO phenomenon itself was born out of satanic deception rather than alien visitation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Parsons, for example, himself, Jack Parsons, actually claimed to have sort of opened a portal in 1947 to allow these things through, or to allow them to come through to a greater degree. Now, if you look back at 1947, it was also the year that, ironically, that Aleister Crowley died. But in 47, we had this huge wave of UFO activity, and Parsons was of the opinion that not only did he open this portal, but it sort of let these things through. And then, if they were sort of demonic or something sort of paranormally based rather than extraterrestrial, then arguably that would be the ushering in of this new era of deception. And the very fact that it was Parsons who opened the door, again, it kind of ties in with this idea of using rituals to sort of conjure up these satanic or demonic entities.
So I'm going to read just a quick part of your input here and I know that I hate to keep bringing up Round Trip to Hell in a Flying Saucer, but
no, that's no problem. It's a good book.
It is a very good book, and I recommend it to everybody out there. It's just fantastic. But you write, they came to the conclusion that the Earth is a farm and that we are the cattle. They came to accept, based on interviews with a number of people with NDEs, theologians, experts on demonology, etc., that these entities essentially harvest and feed upon a poorly defined soul energy upon our deaths. In essence, the Collins elite thinks that because these demonic creatures are basically energy-based, that our energy feeds and fuels them.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, one thing I always say when people bring this up, because this is probably the one aspect of the book more than anything else that actually scares people, and I've had a lot of emails from people who have been literally sort of terrified by that aspect of the story. Now, what I always say to people is that this was sort of the Collins elite's theory. You know, I mean, by their own admission, they weren't able to prove this, but they concluded, based upon how, for example, a number of alien abductees had claimed that they felt that the so-called greys were trying to steal their soul or the essence of what, you know, makes us individual people. And there actually are a lot of reports like that where abductees have said, you know, they felt their soul was being removed from their body and so on. And the Collins elite sort of used those accounts as a basis for developing this theory. And the theory was that essentially they viewed the Earth as like a farm where, you know, we live on the Earth now like the cows in the field, and then, you know, the cows go to the slaughterhouse to feed us, and their view was that when we die, our soul, they can, the way, it's kind of complicated, but the way they looked at it was that these entities had the technology, if you like, is probably the right word to use, to extract the human soul on death. And for reasons that they never really made clear, the Collins elite believes the human soul contains like a form of energy upon which these creatures could live. You know, almost, it's kind of like the Matrix scenario in the movies where, you know, Keanu Reeves wakes up from this sort of dreamlike world to find we're all sort of laid out in all these pods creating energy for all these machines, you know, and it's kind of like that, the idea of, as one of the members called it, like soul factories, where endless millions of souls are recycled and used as energy every day. Now, as I said, it is kind of a terrifying scenario if it's true, but as I said, I always qualify this by pointing out that the Collins elite always said it was a theory.
Correct.
And they based it upon witness testimony. So, you know, it's not sort of cast in stone. It's, you know, one theory among many others about the UFO phenomenon.
So back to the two DoD physicists and Ray Boucher, they continued their experimentation, contacting the NHEs, the non-human entities, is what they originally called them, believing they were going to be speaking with extraterrestrials, but then it turned out, in their opinion, that they were talking to demons instead. And during these experiments, there were deaths that were involved, you know, with the people that were doing the experimentation. Do you have any details on how they died or what experiments they were doing when they died?
Oh, yeah, I mean, Ray actually openly told me that when he met these two DOD guys, they brought a briefcase with them and opened it and showed him a number of photographs of people who had died in these experiments. And as I said, basically, the idea of the contact was to sort of use mind power and psychic powers and altered states to sort of project a thought out to these entities and then have almost like a psychic conversation. It wasn't like the Greys were materializing in the Pentagon or anything like that. But the photographs, Ray told me, all showed different people sitting in what he described as looked like dentist chairs. And he said that the photographs all showed dead people sitting in these dentist-like chairs. And one was a man who supposedly died suddenly of a heart attack in the middle of these experiments. Another one died in a weird fashion through suffocation, where they could never determine how the person had suffocated. It was almost like, you know, like an invisible hand had gripped them around the throat and strangled them and suffocated them that way. And the weirdest one of all was where somebody had literally, their head had sort of caved in on one side as if it had been sort of smashed with like a hammer. You know, somebody had just hit you on the side of the head really hard with a hammer, and it was like a crushing effect to the skull. And this all occurred during the course of these experiments, and of course this was sort of again perceived as like a psychic backlash, that they were trying to put a thought out there to contact these things, and next thing, the people involved are just dying left, right, and centre. And again, that's what led the people on the program to think, well, hang on a minute, if we're just dealing with nuts and bolts aliens, why is this happening? And again, that was perceived as part of this whole sort of black cloud coming over the project. And of course, like people outside of the Pentagon, you know, just members of the public who dabble in a lot of this sort of stuff, it was like, well, now we've opened the door, how do we close it? And that was the big problem. Again, you know, it's what have we done? You know, what have we unleashed?
So they actually took photographs and documented the deaths of these three men. I'm assuming they were men.
No, two were men, I think, and one was a woman.
but they photographed their dead bodies in the chair where they
Mhm.
died at the point of the experiment.
Yeah, Ray absolutely. Ray told me on the record that he saw the photographs. He said that they took the photographs out of this briefcase and showed them to him, and he saw the dead bodies sitting in these sort of dentist-type chair type things. Now, Ray said he had no idea, and that he wasn't told where the pictures were taken or exactly when. You know, it could have been. This was '91 when Ray had the first meeting with them. So it could have been the 80s, it could have been the 70s. We really don't know, and he didn't know. But Ray said to me, you know, you could tell that they didn't look like staged photographs or anything like that, you know, to try and deceive him or whatever, if it was some sort of weird, you know, mind-based experiment that they were trying to play on Ray. He said it looked, you know, just like the real things.
Well, so now the one that died with the sunken skull,
Yeah.
was there any trauma to the skull as far as abrasions or blood spatter or bleeding, or was it just caved in?
Well, I don't know about the blood aspect of it at all, or bruising, but I do know that they said that the cause was like blunt force trauma to the head.
Huh.
But that I truthfully don't know anything like the blood angle or the bruising, and Ray never mentioned that. But apparently, the sort of the blunt force trauma was something that was mentioned in I guess, like the documentation and the paperwork that surrounded, you know, the analysis of how the person died or why.
That is just absolutely insane. It's insane. Do you know if they were if the experiment, these three people that did the experiment, if they were using illicit drugs to try to attempt to make this contact, or were they sober and just tuning in? Were
No,
they suspected to be psychics in any shape, way, or form?
well, we don't really know all the details, but I mean, they would have to have some psychic abilities because the whole point of the program was to try and contact the NHE psychically and
Right.
then try and utilize their powers. Now, one of the theories, of course, is that maybe the powers that they were trying to understand and militarize were actually used against them. You know, that was the whole point. One of the key issues of the program was whether or not sort of the psychic powers that these creatures possessed could be used to sort of kill off like foreign leaders. You know, you could cause, for example, like a foreign leader to have a sudden heart attack or a brain hemorrhage, and people would just think it was down to natural causes, but it could actually be caused psychically. And so I think that's what they were looking into, you know, trying to harness these technologies or these paranormal powers for use in things like assassination and things like that. But it may be that the tables were turned and the very powers that were going to be used, you know, like on an enemy leader or whatever, we actually used on the people in the project. So, in other words, I think they must have had, the ones who died must have had some sort of psychic connection or psychic skills, because clearly they were probably chosen, you know, to take part in the project for that reason.
So at the beginning of Round Trip to Hell in a Flying Saucer, I believe it's actually based on a recount of a story or an event that happened to a gentleman by the name of Cecil Michael.
Yeah, that's right. He had a number of sort of UFO experiences that kind of like with a lot of the stuff that Collins Elite looked at that seemed to be extraterrestrial, but then kind of over time developed into something more sinister, and it all sort of ties in again with the UFO phenomenon being connected with human souls and hell, and he claimed to have sort of seen visions of hell
Right.
at the height of his UFO experiences. So, you know, a lot of this sort of stuff, a lot of people don't realize that it's actually been within the UFO subject for decades, but the extraterrestrial angle is sort of the dominating one in the UFO subject. So a lot of this other stuff kind of gets brushed under the table or ignored. But, I mean, it's not like it's something new. You can actually find it throughout sort of UFO literature, literally going back to the late 40s, never mind just the 50s.
Right, right. But like you said, it does get brushed under the carpet, and that's exactly why I wanted to talk about it tonight, because I think it's a fascinating theory. And it's not talked about enough. I think there's a lot of people out there that have probably never even heard this theory before, that aliens are actually demons. And soul collectors is a term that I've heard. I think you even used it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you can find, as I said, you can even take stuff like Ray's stuff and the Collins elite out of the equation, and you find a lot of stories like abductions. For example, Whitley Strieber, John Mack, David Jacobs, and a variety of other researchers have all got cases on file, so they've written about them, where, as I said earlier, abductees have said that they really did feel that their sort of life force or their soul, however you want to determine it, was actually in danger of being stolen, I guess, in simple terms, by these creatures. And as I said, that has, you can take the Collins elite totally out of the equation, but that's kind of the same scenario. And one of the other interesting little things is that Bob Lazar, who was claimed to have worked at Area 51 in the late 1980s, said that he read a classified briefing on the UFO phenomenon, where he talked about how the aliens viewed us as containers. That was the actual word that appeared in the document. And when Lazar was asked what that meant, he said he didn't know, but he speculated that we were viewed as containers of souls, and that the aliens viewed the soul as very important to their mission. So that kind of ties in as well. And, Lazar wasn't linked with the Collins elite, as far as we know, and I don't think he was, because he just read other documents. But these documents talked about, this whole issue of containers and souls and things like that.
So back to our friend Cecil Michael, who he wrote about how he had two, what I would describe as Nordics, that visited him in his shop, and this was back in 1952. And I believe they spent a few weeks with him, getting to know him, becoming friendly with him, and then they one day took him into their ship and took him to a place that was not very pleasant by any means, as it's described by Cecil.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, he was sort of given this sort of horrific imagery of hell and so on, and when you read his story, it's very interesting, because I think, like with Ray Bochet's stuff, there are kind of pointers, and particularly Parsons's and Crowley's stuff, there are pointers suggesting that some of his experiences may have gone on in like an altered state as well. These things kind of manifested for him, and to what extent it was a physical manifestation, or maybe it was kind of like a projection in his mind. These things were actually projecting imagery. They may never physically have actually
gone anywhere. Yeah,
it may have been sort of projected into his mind like a sophisticated holographic experience. But yeah, he was exposed to this whole scenario of, being contacted by aliens, and then suddenly finding this component that essentially sort of took him on a journey to hell, or a vision of hell, that kind of thing. And of course, again, that sort of raises the question, did he see a literal hell, or were these entities sort of creating imagery in his mind of like his personal subconscious thoughts on what hell would be,
Exactly.
But whatever the answer is, for some reason, these entities themselves presented themselves as extraterrestrial, but then, they weren't talking about science and technology. They wanted to get this imagery of hell across to him. And this has sort of given rise again to the theory that some of these entities are positive and others are negative, and the positive ones are trying to sort of spread the message that, beware of the evil one, so to speak. And so, you have this parallel with the good aliens and the bad aliens, where you have parallel it with sort of angels and demons, everybody sort of working to fight the other one off, so to speak.
So what's your take on the, I believe you don't believe in heaven and hell yourself, but what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I would stress, when I say I don't believe in heaven and hell, I'm not an atheist or anything like that. I actually do believe that something does survive bodily death. But if you ask me, do I think there's a place where there's a guy with a forked tail and horns, and there's another place where
there's pearly gates and
Yeah, Yeah, I think to me that's kind of too simplistic, and I think, I think it's probably based on the fact that ancient man probably knew far more than we do about the realities of life after death, and they knew that there were realms beyond this one, and I think they tried to understand what those realms were and created scenarios to try and explain them, and I think that's why different religions have different concepts about heaven and hell and life after death, but they all have one overriding connection, and that is that that something does survive death and does go somewhere else. So, I fully believe that. I do think something survives death and goes somewhere. But whether it's heaven, hell, whether it's some sort of multi-dimension or some sort of astral plane, I don't know. And, because you have so many different religions with different ideas, I think that demonstrates, again, that nobody really has the full story. So my view is that I do believe something survives death. I do believe that, on the other side, there are highly negative entities that not only play with us, mess with us, but can actually kill us. And I think they're very, very clever and cunning and extremely deceptive to where they can tell us what we want to hear. And the more they tell us we want to hear, the more we get reeled in. We get sort of sucked in by the fascination of what they're telling us.
Right.
And that's when you're almost at that point of no return. And particularly if, as I said earlier, if a person's of a weak-willed character, or they're looking for help from somewhere and things like that, they are the ones who are in the most danger of all, because, they're accepting of everything they hear. They want to, sort of move ahead in life, and they'll sort of, it's like this metaphorical thing of selling your soul, for fame or money.
Right.
That kind of thing happens as well. And I think that's when it really gets problematic. And you often find at the end of the day, lives are sort of damaged and destroyed, and people, there's just descend into chaos because these things have sort of messed around with them for so long. And then it's kind of, at the end of the day, then they spit you out and go on to the next person, So I always say to people, I don't see anything wrong at all with doing paranormal research, but I always say be aware and be wary of everything that comes to you. Don't take it at first glance as it
right.
is. Be very, very careful and try and deliberate and understand what you're dealing with and the potential implications. Because, yes, paranormal research can be fun, it can be exciting, but it does have a dark side to it as well.
Now, I know you deal mostly with ufology, cryptoids, monsters, but I had a guest on a few months ago, Mark Hunneman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
No, I'm not.
He wrote a book called Seeing Ghosts Through God's Eyes. And his theory is every ghost that, a paranormal investigator encounters via EVP, Ouija boards, seance, visually, every ghost, period, is a demon. And I bring this up because you had mentioned previously, just a few minutes ago, that these aliens could do the same thing where they'll, and I think we were talking about the Ouija board at that point, where they'll pretend to be your grandmother or, your friend that's recently passed to gain access, to gain your trust, and to get you sucked in.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your take on ghosts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually don't agree. I don't doubt that does happen. That, I think there is good evidence that in some cases, sort of recently deceased, people, that then the relatives try to contact them and something's come through. And I think there are times when it may well have been something deceptive and manipulative and not the real person. But in saying that, there are cases where, people do have experiences with relatives and there's never any negativity attached to it at all. So, in other words, if these were all demons, if all these cases of relatives coming back or friends coming back, if they were all actually just demonic deception, I would expect that all the relevant surviving relatives would start to have all the negative side effects. Do you see what I mean?
I do.
But they actually don't. That's why. And if they were all demons, it would make sense that everybody would have bad experiences, but people don't. Very often somebody somebody dies and a relative, a couple of nights later has a very strange experience where they wake up in the middle of the night and sees a person standing at the edge of the bed. Well, in many of those cases, there's never any negativity or ill health or anything. It's just a really positive experience. And so that would suggest it's not demonic all the time, because if it was, it'd be illogical for them to sort of just let everybody sort of rest happy and, be thankful that their relative came back. That doesn't make sense if it's all demons. So.
Yeah, I've been struggling with the concept. And I really wish I would have thought to ask him that. Could some of these, especially, recently deceased relatives that, you come and visit after they've died, or your dream visitation or whatever, could they be angels? I mean, if he's talking demons and angels specifically, if there's demons, there's angels, right? You can't have one without the other. So why couldn't it be that perhaps it's an angel that's coming in the form or guise of that relative, just to give the person comfort as they're going through the grieving process?
Yeah, as I said, to me, it's not logical that a demon would come back as a relative if it didn't do any damage, when it came back. If it's all just, as I said, a pleasant experience, that's not the way a demon works. It comes back with a goal, or it comes through with a goal. I've had a sort of very weird experience about 10 years ago when my dog died, and I truly believe something came back. Over a couple of days after her immediate death, on the one day there's a very strong wet dog smell out in the garage of the house. It just came from nowhere, very overpowering. And once I woke up and heard like the pitter-patter of claws coming down the corridor. It was like a stone corridor by the bedroom. And it was just like the noise she used to make when, she'd wake up in the middle of the night, she'd come down the corridor and jump on the bed,
Right.
And there were a lot of things like that happened sort of 3 or 4 or 5 days after she died, and then it was gone. And, there was no negative backlash. There was no frightening demonic activity. There was nothing other than just, it was a very cool, kind of reassuring, thankful experience, So, again, if that was sort of a demonic thing, well, where was the end result of the demons trying to be manipulative? There was none of that at all. It was just a very sort of positive experience.
I'm really glad you shared that story, because you're helping me regain my perspective since that interview. Since he told me that, I've really been struggling with the concept. So
well, I think the thing for you to remember, for everybody to remember, is that, like I said earlier, with the human race, there are, I'm absolutely sure, in the paranormal world, or paranormal realms, I should say, both positive and negative entities, and the trick is to understand which is which, and which ones to work with and which ones to avoid. I don't think it's like a blanket thing of it's all this or it's all that.
Right, right.
I think that the thing is, it's for up to us to determine if we want to deal with this sort of stuff, and if we do, make sure we follow the right path. And if you do want to investigate the sort of darker stuff, well, that's fine, but do it from the perspective of where you can try and remain sort of balanced and detached and not get sucked in by these things as well. So there's lots of things to think about, but it's definitely not all evil, but it is difficult sometimes to figure out which is the evil side.
So bottom line, do you think aliens are aliens, or aliens are demons and angels?
Well, my view is I don't think they're extraterrestrial. I used to, when I was sort of younger. I think they're more likely to be interdimensional. I think there's something that coexists with us in sort of multi-dimensions or multi-realms that, normally we're not able to access. But, if you have the technology or the whatever is required, you can jump from one dimension to another. Now, the big question is, are these dimensions, these multi-dimensions and realms, are they kind of like heaven and hell, or are they some sort of scientific, something that can be explained scientifically?
Right.
I don't know. I'll be honest,
But what's your opinion?
Well, my opinion is that the phenomenon is interdimensional. I think that's far more likely than extraterrestrial. But I'm just not sure if interdimensional, means heaven and hell, or if it means, just another realm. Do you see what I mean?
Well, and I mean, we're just putting titles on things. They
Yeah,
could be
that's
one
right.
and the
Just
same.
yeah, I mean, it could well be one and the same. So my personal view is that it's interdimensional, not extraterrestrial.
So you have a new book due for release June of next year called Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, Suspicious Deaths, Mysterious Murders, and Bizarre Disappearances in UFO History.
Mm-hmm.
And where you write about suspicious suicides, murders, and conveniently timed heart attacks. Can you tell us a little bit about the upcoming book?
Yeah, sure. Well, this will be published by New Page Books in June of next year. And I should stress, it's not like the sort of stuff we've been talking about today, which sort of, death from demonic entities or things like that.
Right,
it's
right.
basically a study of UFO researchers who may have got a little bit too close to the truth, and then, they've suddenly had a car accident or they committed suicide out of the blue, but the circumstances are very sort of suspicious. But I also talk in the book quite a bit about, or I will be, I'm still writing it right now, actually. But also talking about cases where pilots have vanished or planes have crashed while trying to chase UFOs, and things like that. So it's basically sort of a catalogue of sort of the last 60 years of researchers and pilots and people in the military even who've sort of had suspicious deaths after getting a little bit too close to the phenomenon than perhaps other people might have liked them to.
So I imagine the theory is that some of them were probably taken out by MIBs, Men in Black, i.e. the government, and then some of them were taken out by aliens themselves, referring to the pilots.
Yeah, there's some cases where, for example, aircraft have chased UFOs and only for their engines and electric systems just to fail. They've just plummeted to the ground. But yeah, there are other ones where it seems to be sort of MIB type activity, and somebody's getting close to something, and the next minute they're dead. So a lot of strange stories like that going back right from the 40s, pretty much up to the present day even.
And now 1947, that was the first year that, the term UFO was coined in 1947, and I think that was the first reported sighting of a UFO, as far as in the news.
Yeah, I mean, certainly 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in June over Washington State when he saw these so-called flying saucers, that really sort of ushered in the modern era. Before that, yes, people had seen strange lights in the sky. I mean, for example, in the Second World War, military pilots reported sightings of what became known as Foo Fighters, the small balls of light that were seen. Then in the 1800s, you had a wave of what became known as the Phantom Airship wave. So, people have seen strange things in the sky for literally hundreds and even thousands of years. But certainly the terms flying saucer and UFO, they're sort of relatively modern, the last 60 years or so. But they, the whole phenomenon, as we see it today, really did kick off in 47.
And I bring that up because that goes back to the Collins Elite, Aleister Crowley, the DOD and Ray Boucher and all of that. So we kind of just went full circle there.
Yeah, everything sort of goes back to 47 in many respects. With Parsons' rituals and opening this gateway, and then Kenneth Arnold's sightings and the military investigations.
Roswell,
yeah.
So where can my listeners find your books and follow you and your upcoming endeavors?
Well, people can reach me at my blog, which is Nick Redfern Fortean, Fortean, nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com, or they can type me into Facebook. There's actually a few Nick Redferns on Facebook, but if you scroll down the list, you'll find me. And the books are all available on Amazon, and many of them you can buy off the shelves in Barnes & Noble as well.
Excellent. Nick, it was a sincere honor to have you on the show and to have this time with you, and I can't thank you enough.
Oh, well, I appreciate you having me on the show, Marie. Thank you.
And happy holidays to you and to all my listeners. Until the next episode, stay scared.